Hello, folks, and welcome to the latest edition of the Absolute Truth Absolutely podcast. Once again, here is your host, Gio. So glad that you can join me for this newest episode. On this particular episode, I'd like to speak to something that I was watching recently and clarify a few things, because there's an awful lot of misinformations, outright lies that are being propagated on the internet to try to further discredit Christianity. Not that it can be discredited, but that has not impeded recalcitrant atheists, especially of the YouTube commentary kind, to offer what they believe to be mass evidence, increasing evidence against the historicity of Christ, the canonical Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, the New Testament, etc., etc., etc. I was watching a video the other day on YouTube in which, again, a recalcitrant atheist whose channel has everything to do with atheism and everything also to do against Christianity, where he tries to discredit Josephus as a source from which we can draw evidence to support the fact that Christ was in fact a historical figure. Now, if any of you have read any of Josephus's books or works or portions of his works, you'll notice that many Christian apologists throughout the years have pointed to this historian's work in order to look to external evidence, in other words, outside of the Bible, to prove that Christ was in fact a historical figure. As a matter of fact, what most people do not know is that when you visit outside sources, once again, away from the Bible, away from the New Testament, to try to find external evidence for the existence of Christ, most of the persons that wrote about Jesus wrote so in a negative manner. They didn't say that he did not exist. They just were not offering praise, as it were, for Christianity, Christians, and Christ in particular. There was obviously animosity against Christianity, and you can find these sources. They're readily available on the internet. On this edition in particular, we're going to focus on why atheists have now sought and are seeking to discredit Josephus in the minds of listeners and viewers of YouTube videos and whatnot, because it is a part of their crusade to give the impression that really there is no evidence, there is no proof for the existence of Christ, much less for his miracles, his teachings, and his subsequent death and resurrection. In this particular video that I was watching, this man says that Josephus cannot be trusted. And he mentions a few things which we will cover in this episode. Chief among them is what was known as the suicide pact that occurred in the city of Jotapata. Yes, it's a funny name, but let me give you a background on what happened in this particular city in AD 67. Vespasian, being the commander of the Romans, he moved around Judea in order to violently quell a Jewish rebellion. At that point, the Jews had risen. There was an insurgency that they created against the Roman state due to various oppressive policies that the Romans had put forth against anyone whom was not a Roman citizen. And this had gone on for long enough, and the Jews wanted to reestablish, as it were, an independent kingdom free from the tyranny of the Roman government. And Vespasian, being the commander of the Roman government, the commander of the Roman army, rather, he visited many of these cities and towns in Judea to squelch this uprising in a violent manner. Once he arrived at the city of Jotapata, for 47 days, the inhabitants and the soldiers of that city, they held out. That was a pretty magnificent feat, considering that the Roman army was the most impressive, strongest army at that time, at that world. And you can find the details of this, furthermore, in Josephus' writing, The Jewish War. Josephus was heading the defenses. He was the general, as it were, of the soldiers in that city, and he was also one of the priests in that city. Well, once they were able to penetrate the fortifications of the city, the Roman army killed more than 40,000 of the city's inhabitants. However, Josephus and approximately 40 other survivors, they managed to escape to the bottom of a cistern alongside the city, or rather beneath the city. Now, the details are rather sketchy, but there was a mass suicide that occurred. And according to Josephus himself, what occurred was that there were a few of the soldiers who were arguing that they should turn themselves over to the Romans and ask for clemency. Rather, a majority, they were arguing that it would be best to kill themselves so that they would be spared the torture at the hands of the Romans, something that, according to Josephus himself, he was vehemently against, but then he agreed to. Now, it is becoming more and more evident when you read that particular passage in Josephus's works that he had the following outcome in mind all along. He did not want to commit suicide. Since many of his other compatriots were so willing to commit suicide, he said, fine, let's give ourselves over to a pact. We'll draw lots, and the first person to draw a lot will be the first one to be killed, and then the second person who draws the lot will kill the first person, so on and so forth. Now, many different scenarios have been offered by historians. One that has become rather famous even among mathematicians, where now they've even denominated it the Josephus problem. Others have called it the Roman roulette. What did they mean by that? Well, some mathematicians whom also study history have given the following explanation about what actually happened. That under this version of events, Josephus, he had the holdouts stand in a circle, and then in his own mind, he began to count off every third person to be killed in a particular turn. So Josephus, as it were, he calculates what position he would have need to stand on, and I think the math showcases he would have had to have been the 31st in a position of 41 so that he may evade with his life intact. That's one scenario that historians and mathematicians have offered, but we're going to trust, as it were, Josephus's version of events because it's the only retelling of the event that we had. Well, after this mass suicide pact was undertaken, Josephus and the last person whom were supposed to, one was supposed to kill the other and the last person was supposed to kill himself, supposedly they came to their senses and they said, hey, why don't we just turn ourselves over to the Romans and ask for clemency? And that is exactly what happened. After he was released, Josephus became a trusted advisor to Vespasian, whom eventually became Caesar, and to his sons Titus and Domitian, and he even adopted their family name, Flavius. Well, now this caused a bit of consternation and anger in the Jewish ranks, where they ended up denominating Josephus as a traitor and a coward because now he became an apologist for the Roman government, asking the Jews to bring down their arms, as it were, to lay down their arms and simply submit to Roman rule. And eventually he writes his Antiquities, which we're very thankful that he wrote that because it gives us a very vivid picture in words of life during the Roman era. Now, this is the narrative that atheist, which I mentioned earlier, whose video that I viewed a few days ago, mentions, in order to arrive at the following conclusion. If Josephus was such a reprobate individual, notice that he's making a value judgment about Josephus, then how can we trust his writings on Jesus? But his attack on Josephus's writings and the veracity thereof do not conclude there. He continues by stating that the specific portion of Josephus's work in antiquity, specifically, we are making mention here of book number 18, chapter 3.3, also known among historians and historical circles as the Testimonium Flavianum, where he mentions Christ vividly, the person of Jesus Christ. That cannot be trusted. It cannot be trusted is because it was a Christian insertion or an insertion by a Catholic monk in the 8th century into the Antiquities, and therefore it cannot be trusted. Therefore, leading the viewer, leading the listener to believe that Josephus cannot be quoted as a source for extra biblical proof, external proof that Jesus Christ existed. I'd like to offer my commentary and also divulge a few facts that will lead the listener to a completely different conclusion. And at the end, you'll notice that this is another tactic by virulent, recalcitrant, God-hating atheists, yes, God-hating, it's not that they don't believe that God does not exist, is that they are trying to somehow validate the ridiculous belief that one can believe that there is no God because supposedly there is no evidence for a deity, for God. And what he would have the listeners believe is that this, again, it's completely irrelevant. One should not pay attention to it. And the whole idea, folks, I don't know if you've noticed this. I'm pretty sure you have, especially if you are in tune to Christian apologetics. Atheists are always moving the goalposts around for the level of credulity. If you show me this, then I'll believe. No, that's not sufficient, even though that should fill the mark, as it were, for evidence, for believability, etc., which demonstrates that it's just capriciousness on their part. They don't want to recognize the God of the universe, as if in some way, shape, or form they could clack their heels together and say there's no place like home and make God disappear. It doesn't then, we understand then the Bible doesn't say in vain that the fool has said in his heart there is no God. Notice that the Bible denominates such a person as a fool. But more specifically, I'd like to provide evidence that is omitted by commentators such as the one that I have mentioned on YouTube, which would lead the listener, lead the viewer to a completely different conclusion about extra-biblical sources, which again point to the existence of Christ. But before I continue, I'd like to mention the following, because this same atheist undertook a debate with a Christian, and one of the things that happened in that interchange, in that subsequent video, which was a response, I think, to this original video, is the following, and I've heard other atheists use this same excuse. They'll state, you cannot use, and they'll state this either explicitly or implicitly, you cannot use the Gospels as proof positive that Jesus Christ existed. Neither could you believe the narrative contained therein. You need external evidence. This is something that I've asked myself continually, and I don't know why many Christians simply accept it as a valid argument. Why? Why can't we use what the gospel writers wrote as evidence for not only the existence of Christ, but also as evidence for what he said and evidence of what happened to him and what he did? I wonder whose standard we're employing now. And no one, I haven't seen anyone whom has debated atheists take this on. Maybe very few. I don't want to pretend as if somehow this has not been taken up. This has not been signaled out by other Christian apologists and other people whom enjoy apologetics. But I always notice, at least from what I have seen, from what I have heard, atheists always present this objection as if it were valid in some way, shape, or form, a legitimate objection. And in truth, it isn't. How can you simply discount the gospel texts themselves when they are probably the most attested documents in all of history? Just on the New Testament alone, we find more than 20,000 extant manuscripts, some of them even dating to the 1st century, folks. The New Testament is probably the most attested documentation or documents in the history of the world. Now, knowing this, and mind you, that number is ever growing due to increasing archaeological evidence, but atheists knowing that they can no longer combat against that particular number, now what they're choosing to do is change tactics and trying to vilify, as it were, signal out the other sources that point to Christ's existence, to his terrestrial ministry, and trying to discredit those. Now, in the case of Josephus, I would ask you to put yourself in that very same scenario. Surely, we only have Josephus to trust as it pertains to the narrative of what happened in Jotapata. I wholeheartedly admit, and also the truth of the matter is that even though Josephus's writings have not been questioned, because in truth there aren't that many extant manuscripts, especially in the Greek, maybe 170 of them, and the earliest they came, which some would say in the 8th century. In Latin, though, they do come a little earlier, around the 6th century. Still, most historians, the popular consensus among historians is that what Josephus wrote was a pretty accurate retelling of history. Put yourself in Josephus' shoes. If you don't want to kill yourself, and now all of your soldiers are offering that everyone engage in a mass suicide, wouldn't you have also come up with that very crafty way of living? I know I would. I wouldn't want to take away my own life. Now, I'll leave that, I'll leave the question of the morality of the thing to the listener. But just because Josephus undertakes what I would call a secretive campaign to save his own neck, which, by the way, in a way also showcases the sanctimony of this particular atheist, because if he would have found himself in that very same position and he wouldn't want his life to be taken away from him, he would have either run away or concocted, a plan similar to Josephus's vein in order to save his own neck. So that's sanctimonious on his part, and it's also moral preening coming from an atheist, which is rather rich, because they're always saying that we're the ones who love to lecture everyone else on morality. Nonetheless, let's examine the texts themselves, because as you'll notice, he points to the Testimonium Flavianum, and he says, remember what the claim says by this atheist, and he's not the only one, by the way. There are other atheists who say the same thing. This is a Christian interpolation. This was something that was placed by a monk in around the 8th century after the death AD, and it's not original to Josephus. Let's also allude to historians, well-respected historians, especially historians whom dedicated themselves to studying the life, times, and the writings of Josephus to see if that is in fact the case. The text in question, again, Testimonium Flavianum says the following, quote, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him, and the tribe of the Christians, so-called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Again, this appears, Antiquities of the Jews, Flavius Josephus, Book 18, Chapter 3:3. If we move forward in Josephus's work, we arrive at Book 20, Chapter number 9, subtext 1, which says the following, and now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananus. Now the report goes that this eldest Ananus proved the most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders, above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. The text continues, but I'd like to focus on that particular portion of the passage. This atheist and other atheists, they never make mention of Book 20, Chapter 9, subtext 1, where he mentions James the Just, the brother of Jesus. And it is in the original text, this is not under dispute, where it says, who was called Christ. Many secular historians have even stated that this cannot be a forgery or an interpolation because of the lack of laudatory language, as is found in the Testimonium Flavianum, which we will return to in a second and provide the truth of what happened as it pertains to interpolation. So you'll notice that in Book 20, 2 books later, Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus, and he also uses the word Christos, in Greek, Christ, the anointed one, according to the translation, and he specifically mentions Christ. Now, many atheists, when you do signal this out to them, they have craftedly come up with another alternative. They'll state, well, he could have mentioned, maybe he was mentioning another Christos. I'm sorry. When you use the term Christ next to Jesus, there can only be one Jesus Christ. That is impossible. That's one of the many defenses that they'll use, so-called, against the veracity of what appears here. So let's say the Testimonium Flavianum does not exist. Still, in book 20, chapter 9, subtext 1, Jesus Christ appears in the writings of Josephus. So it's present. They can't deny that. Furthermore, to prove that there is almost a perfect harmony, as it were, between what Luke wrote in his gospel, what the other gospel writers wrote, I would direct your attention to book number 18, again, chapter 5, subtext 2, where Josephus makes reference to John the Baptist. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him who was a good man. Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was put there to death. Folks, this concords very nicely with what Luke mentions in his gospel. And there was no, what shall we say, there was no coordination between the gospel writers and Josephus, a man whom, again, provides no laudatory language for Christ. Again, as we'll notice in the Flavianum, Testimonium Flavianum, yes, there is laudatory language, but again, that has been proven to be an interpolation approximately placed there at around the 8th century. But still, in the original text, as has been proven, in that place, in that particular spot in his Antiquities, book 18, chapter 3, subtext 3, Josephus still mentions Christ, just without the laudatory language. So you see that there is an amazing harmony here. And this is years removed, mind you, from when the gospel writers have written their individual texts. This came many years later, and still Christ's fame was so that at the time that Josephus writes his histories, his Antiquities of the Jews, he has to make mention of Jesus Christ. Now, let's return to the Testimonium Flavianum. What are the portions that were eventually interpolated into the text? Here we have to allude to probably the last preeminent scholar on Josephus, Louis Feldman. He died recently, March 25th, 2017, and he was an American professor of classics and literature. He taught classics and literature at Yeshiva University. He had taught there since 1955, and he was a scholar of Hellenistic civilization, and specifically the works of Flavius Josephus. The works that this man has put forth on the Antiquities of the Jews, on Josephus himself, have been widely respected and seen as the foundational work for understanding Josephus. In other words, he was the last preeminent Josephus scholar, to the point where when he died, other historians and writers such as Robert E. Van Vorst referred to Feldman as, quote, the death, or referred to when Feldman died, as, quote, the dean of Josephan scholars, end quote. And Paul Mayer is another one whom lauded his writings. He himself has stated that when he has looked at other texts, extant manuscripts, and compared the different versions of Josephus's text in Arabic, in Greek, in Latin, etc., he says that he subscribed, as it were, to what he calls partial authenticity. And this is the majority view, the consensus view among historians. Now, I know that that's a slight appeal to authority, and just because the majority of historians view something as is, it doesn't necessarily make the thing true. But the reason that most historians now view, they cling, as it were, to the partial authenticity argument, is due to the fact that when they've studied the extant manuscripts and they've compared it to one another, the evidence dictates that a good amount of the original text, without the laudatory language that was placed there later on by monks, etc., people whom were copying all of this, it's still present in the earliest extant manuscripts. So, Gio, how would the original read? Well, I'm glad that you ask that. The original should read something like this, quote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man." Notice that it doesn't include if it be lawful to call him a man. "For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and many of Greek origin." Now, I'd like to place something here because for me it has not been clear of when Josephus mentions Greek here, if he's specifically mentioning Gentiles or if he's mentioning Hellenicized Jews. That's something I have to study further, and I would ask the listener to do their own research as it pertains to this particular portion of the passage. That's something that in my mind is still in doubt, and I'd have to further research that before I make any assertions or affirmations with respect to that portion of the text. Anyways, "And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him." Notice that there's no mention of a third day being resurrected. That was an interpolation also. "And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." So you'll notice that what this atheist and other atheists whom are repeating this atheist and other atheists whom they just digest anything that appears on the atheistic blogs and they repeat it as if it were true, and in which they state the totality of that passage does not appear at all in Josephus's original works. Louis Feldman, the most preeminent Josephus scholar, stated that he clung to the partial authentication, to the partial authenticity of the text, that there were only brief portions of that particular text in which they were interpolated later on. Certain phrases were interpolated later on, but in fact, Josephus did speak to the existence of Jesus Christ. So please do not allow atheists, many of these recalcitrant atheists, to try to fool you into believing that Josephus cannot be used as a source, as an authoritative source, as it were, to point extra biblically, as it were, outside of the Bible to the existence of Jesus Christ. If you leave it to many of these capricious atheists, they will try to eliminate and set the bar so impossibly high for believability and evidentiary proof. The Bible would never be able to be proven, because that's the point. They don't want it in their own futile minds to be proven. The other aspect I'd like to mention, this is another important note to mention to our listeners. If you visit Origins, and I'm not speaking about origin as in the genesis of something, but Origen, what many people consider to be a church father, Origen, he himself, in his commentary on the book of Matthew, he rebuked the idea that Josephus would not speak more laudatory, more in praise of Jesus Christ. He stated that, and this is something that Louis Feldman and others have pointed to support the idea that the passage, in the manner in which we have just quoted, it did appear in the original Antiquities of the Jews, because Origen and Eusebius, by the way, they signal out that Josephus had in fact written about Jesus Christ, but that he did not do so more in a praising manner of Jesus Christ. So I hope that all of this evidence that we have put forth will help you not only to strengthen your faith, because when we examine these things, these certainly bring assurance to the heart, as it were, that the Bible is in fact the Word of God, and that it gives us more and more. Even if we go outside, we find that God has certified everything he has written in his word. Gio, what if we didn't have all of this? Well, God is true, and let every man be a liar. It's true based on the fact that God said so, and he inspired this. And also we can look at the supernatural maintenance, the preservation of the text, and how well attested the New Testament is to point to the fact that God, in his infinite mercy and grace, has left these things for us. It's like Jesus Christ himself said, ladies and gentlemen, blessed are those who have not seen but believed. But nonetheless, I know that this will help you, especially the younger folk, when they are going through the university system, through the public school system, when they are, the testimony of the Bible is attacked. These facts will help them rebuff the lies put forth by people whom are the enemies of God. But let us not forget that even though they are enemies of God, the gospel still must be preached to them because they are lost. So I hope this helps you. Once again, folks, thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please email me, geotimes7, J-I-O, the word times, the number 7, at protonmail.com, geotimes7 at protonmail.com. Please remember that every Tuesday and Thursday, we publish new podcast episodes through SoundCloud, through YouTube. Shortly, we will upload the newest feed to iTunes, and we are working to have our podcast featured also on Stitcher.com. That's all the time we have left for this edition. Please remember to visit the website also, geodcblog, giodcblog.wordpress.com. Until the next occasion that we meet, may the Lord shine his face upon you.